I mean, one of the things that was discussed in Affirmation Generation, which has been thrown around by trans activists for a very long time in terms of pressuring people to accept the idea of trans kids, but also in terms of pressuring therapists and parents and medical professionals into medically transing kids and youth. So prescribing hormones or puberty blockers first, and then hormones, and then you know these surgeries. Um, is that if kids don't get these medical treatments and these surgeries, they'll commit suicide. And trans activists will throw all sorts of stats out there and say, these kids are really at risk, and if you don't let them trans, or if you don't trans them, they'll kill themselves. I'm curious to know what you know about those statistics and what you know about suicidality in kids who say they have gender dysphoria, or who are diagnosed with gender dysphoria.
I'm so glad that you invited me to debunk this myth. It is the most important myth that I could possibly debunk, and I will go around debunking it until it is thoroughly debunked. Um,
Okay.
so, okay. So, and I just did this on American Thought Leaders with Jan Jekielek. I went into this as well. So I'm going to repeat myself for anyone who heard that. So, will commit suicide? No. Might. Commit? No. Consider, contemplate, or attempt. Those are different levels of severity, right? Um, is it true that trans identified youth have higher than average rates of suicidal ideation? Yes. Can we separate that out from their comorbidities? No. Their rates, as far as I'm aware, are commensurate with the comorbidities that we are failing to address with the diagnostic overshadowing of the gender dysphoria. Now, suicidal ideation is one thing, suicidal behavior is another, and completed suicide is another still. So, suicidal ideation is common. I'm a therapist. I'm used to talking about it, right? Like, I've had hundreds of patients over the years. I've maybe had thousands of patients. I don't know. And I've talked to dozens and dozens of people who've had thoughts of suicide. Probably hundreds. So I'm, the idea at some point in your life that you might be better off dead, or the passing fantasy of, crashing on your way home when your lover just left you. I mean, these are normal parts of the human experience. Of course, they vary in severity, but I just want to say for a moment that suicidal ideation in itself is not a boogeyman. It is a thing that happens to people during times of stress, and for some people it happens more than others because of their vulnerabilities, right? Um, Now, ideation is one thing, behavior is another, right? So when it comes to behavior, we have non suicidal self injurious behavior, and then we have, actual planned or impulsive suicide attempts. And each of those has their success rates. Teenagers are more likely to engage in non suicidal self injurious behavior, suicide threats, which are attention seeking, and unsuccessful suicide attempts that land them hospitalized and treated. But all of that is, highly dependent on their environment. And this is mediated by a few things. It's mediated by what kids are being told that they should say and how they should feel, which is why I think it's criminal that anyone, let alone a therapist, would ever suggest to a child that they should be thinking about suicide, or that they should frankly threaten it in order to get what they want and back their parents into a corner with regard to affirmation, which we all know is what's really going on in a lot of these cases. Okay. Another thing is that um, teenagers are generally, as long as their parents aren't terribly neglectful people, in the vast majority of cases, teenagers are safe at home with their parents because the love of a parent for their child is a huge protective factor. And there are all kinds of things that parents can do, especially with the help of a responsible therapist, not an affirming therapist, a responsible therapist who actually understands these issues, to keep their kids safe at home. So, as a therapist, if I had a kid express suicidal ideation, and I'm not working with under 18s anymore right now, but, I would assess, there are things I would do to assess the level of severity, right? the Whether they had any plan, whether they had any access to the means that they were thinking about using, whether they had any intention, what the level of urgency was, what triggered those thoughts, when it was likely to happen, what their reasons for wanting to die were, but also what their reasons for wanting to live were. And for most kids, there's a lot of ambivalence, um, and not years and years of entrenched hopelessness. So, with a parent, um, there are things that a parent can learn to do with proper help to assess and monitor and work around their kids' actual level of threat. There are times that a parent ideally should be able to take a kid to a hospital. Now, what the hospitals are doing to kids is a whole other issue that we can talk about, because hospitals are not helping with this stuff. When a kid gets hospitalized and they claim to be trans and they say that my parents' failure to affirm me is a reason that I was thinking about suicide, the hospitals, again, diagnostic overshadowing, ignore all the other issues, focus on the gender dysphoria, split up the family, pressure the parents into a corner saying, your kid's going to commit suicide if you don't, right? Like, that's not what hospitals should be doing. They make it worse. And then the kid learns, I can just go to the hospital to get affirmed.
Yeah.
So basically, there are all these confounding factors. But the thing is, a kid is safe at home with their parents because parents aren't going to let a kid do that on their watch. Parents will quit their jobs if they have to, or they will get a medical leave of absence. They will take away their kids' devices. They will check their kids' room for weapons and sharps. They will lock up the medications. And, you know, they will take off the door of their kids' room if they have to. I'm not saying that's always the right solution. But the idea that somebody's kid is just going to go complete suicide is a gross misrepresentation of how suicidal ideation in adolescence works. Um, and the fact that there are adults saying that is a huge part of the problem. The
Yeah.
fact that there are therapists or doctors saying in front of a kid and their parents, you better affirm or your kid is at risk of suicide, is making it much worse. That's planting a seed in a vulnerable mind. And that's telling a kid that they have no other way out. And I think that's grossly irresponsible of us to be sending that message. My real concern is with the long term suicide risk of people who choose to pursue these medical interventions, because those medical interventions induce chronic pain and disabilities and take away people's protective factors.